Arnab Mukherjee says, "Hey Keanu and Lucas, and this will be the last one we'll take today. Today I have a question regarding usage of data, analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence in football. I know that Microsoft and some other tech giants work with NBA teams closely, both in terms of recruitment and in-game strategy. Why is that not the case in football? In my opinion, a tie-up with maybe Google will put a club like Real Madrid above everyone's level. I think Real Madrid should tie up with a big tech company given our financial situation. Investing nearly 140 million for Rodrigo and Vinicius and Reinier, all three very similar kind of players, shows us the failure to analyze the data properly. If we're going for youngsters and trying to buy them based on potential, I think we should collaborate with the professionals."
Interesting. I think it has something to do with the culture here in Europe. As you know, I'm a big fan of NBA, and even I even watch American football, and I know and I've seen how big into stats are not only the reporters and the media, but also the fans. Here it's not that big of a deal. I mean, obviously they take into account goals, assists, and you know they're starting to consider chances created and all that, but it's not as big as it is in basketball and American football in the US. So I think it's down to culture. I think I don't think the whole statistical analysis has I don't know how to properly say it in English, has evolved or developed in football just yet. I don't think there's a way to translate from a statistical standpoint what's happened in a football game just yet. I don't think that kind of a statistical system has been invented yet. I don't know what you think, because I know that you being in America just like are big into analytics and have been studying them and take them into consideration way more than I do, just because of this culture thing I mentioned. What do you think?
What part of it do you think that doesn't exist? I'm unclear what you mean.
I don't. You can look at a stat sheet in an NBA game, and kind of figure out how the game has gone, and you know who has played great, who has played great. And for example, in football, from the Iniesta, statistically speaking, Iniesta was a very poor football player, and we all know that he was brilliant. So I don't think
Zidane too.
Exactly. So I don't think the statistical analysis in football has reached the point where you can actually take a look at someone's game and or even define a player by only looking at his stats. And that's something that has definitely happened in American sports like basketball or American football. I don't think it's reached that kind of point in European football. What do you think?
You're right. Basketball, like simple analytics in basketball tell us a lot more than simple analytics in football. What I mean by that is, like, if you're assessing who the MVP is in the NBA, you can. I'm not saying this is the only thing that they take into consideration, but you can quickly look at points per game, PER,
field goal percentage,
assists, all that stuff, field goal percentage. You can they have clutch statistics. That is a lot easier to kind of filter in the NBA and say, okay, this is the MVP based on this. In football, it doesn't really work that way. And like you mentioned, some players in football don't look great analytically, like Iniesta and Zidane. In basketball, if somebody doesn't look great analytically, like a Draymond Green, but you know he's good, they actually have a way to do that now, because they have defensive rating. They have if when Draymond is around the rim, percentage of field goal percentage of the opposing teams at the rim when Draymond is there. There's a lot of ways to measure defense that there isn't in football. And also there's the fact that football, there's more players on the field, so numbers don't really tell you much. Like basketball plus minus tells you way more than football plus minus, because there's 5 players instead of 11 players. So there's a lot of ways that, football, it's harder to do that in football, obviously. But Um, I will say, like, in terms of data and technology and stuff, there are a lot of football teams using analytics, but so there's it's one thing to use it and use the tech and use the analysis and partner up with different companies to do that, and clubs do that, by the way. Most big clubs do. I know Arsenal do, Liverpool do, Real Madrid and Barcelona do. And the thing is, a lot of these clubs, they don't publicize this, right? They want all this stuff to be secretive. They don't want people to know what technology and stuff they're using. But there's one thing to have the technology, and there's another thing to interpret it. So you have to have that technology, but you also need someone to be able to interpret it properly and tell you what it means and give you recommendations based on that. Like Matt has said this in a couple times in the podcast, Lucas, that he was talking to some executive of one of these clubs. I don't know who it was, and he didn't say, but he said that Barcelona have some of the best tech around, but they don't have someone to tell them how to use it. And if they had someone to tell them how to use it, they wouldn't have signed Griezmann, which is basically the same position as Messi. They just got in the way of each other. They would have used that money to sign someone who would have complemented Messi, but not to get in his way. And now they're paying for that. So,
quick story. I spent one of my trips to Madrid when I was covering Real Madrid's games pretty much every week. From the Bernabeu, I spent the whole trip back to Valencia sitting alongside a Russian guy who worked for an analytics company in football, obviously, and the work they did, they recorded every game by themselves, and then split every single play, pass, tackle, headers, clearances, and all that for every single player. Like it was an amazingly great amount of work, a massive work in terms that like they had to do that for the 22 players involved. And it was something I was very interested in because and he told me that he worked close with clubs like Levante and all that. That's why he lived in Valencia, and they used that database, and they had a database for pretty much every player playing in the major European leagues. Again, showing every single pass they made for the last 5 seasons. Every single tackle won, every single header, every single clearance, and all that. It's obviously not. This isn't as statistical or analytical as we were talking about, but it's something to prove, as you mentioned, that obviously these systems exist, but maybe they're not public to the fans as they are in America.
I also think, like, with regards to using data to the question asked here is like Renier, Vinicius, Rodrigo, similar-ish players. I mean, Vinicius and Rodrigo are kind of similar, different in some ways, but similar. Renier, Jesus, slightly different than both those, but I understand the point that's being made here. Yeah,
exactly.
But I think the problem with that is that I think Real Madrid were thinking about something different when they signed those players, in that you just don't really know how to project a young player's career based on just analytics alone. Like clubs will use that to look at how good they are, but it doesn't mean that they'll pan out or they won't improve in certain aspects. And also, you don't know which one will pan out. So I think if the hope was Rodrigo, Vinicius, Renier, one of them would pan out, then you would ultimately choose and then sell the others. I think that's part of it. Like, you don't expect all three to be part of your long-term strategy. Right. I do think, like, also in terms of how this will evolve, how data will evolve and tech will evolve. The BBC had an article about this recently, and one of the analytics guys, and also I think he's also a psychologist, and I keep forgetting his name. I really enjoy anytime like something gets published and he's part of the study or whatever. I always tend to read it. I think he's a Dutch guy. I apologize. I should have looked up his name. But he was saying that, like, kind of where this is headed is that they'll start being able to do simulations of what works and what doesn't. Like, for example, like in chess, you can simulate, like, you can play artificial intelligence and, okay, if I do this, he's going to do this and that. that they can start doing that in football, like on how to break low blocks. So like if I make this pass here, how is the defense going to react? All right, so next time let's try this. Let's see if that works. Things like that, which are kind of interesting. I mean, to look at. So it'll be interesting to see how artificial intelligence also play a factor in this long term.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You also, I feel, Kijan, that we also don't need. I mean, I'm a big fan of analytics, and sometimes I don't even watch NBA games and only pay attention to the stat sheets.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's also important to keep understanding that stats don't tell the whole story, even in the NBA, even in American football, and definitely more in football. Like, stats don't tell the whole story, and it will still be important to have a knowledge of the game and how important a player might be, even without paying attention to the analytics. For example, how was the name of the Houston Rockets executive, who is a big fan of analytics, and ultimately, the Rockets got it wrong pretty much every time. Morey, I think, right? Daryl Morey, I think.
Yeah.
He was he built. I mean, from what I know and from what I've gathered throughout the years, he made and built his teams based pretty much entirely on analytics. And Houston was a force to be reckoned with for the last few seasons, for sure. But ultimately, he didn't reach the ultimate goal. And if you pay attention to the guy who won the NBA this season, to the star who won the NBA this season, that's a guy who has quite a few wrinkles and flaws in his game from an analytical perspective. So I think it's still important to have your foot on the ground, as you say here, as we say here in Spain, and still have a knowledge of the game.
That's an interesting point to bring up. And one thing that Morey had in terms of his philosophy too was, if you have basically
don't shoot from the mid range, right?
Well, yeah, I mean that was definitely a big. I mean, he looked at it as just pure math. He also didn't believe as much as other people that team chemistry mattered and egos mattered. That if you just put the math together and the algorithm together, that you're gonna give yourself a good chance to win. Which, by the way, he came pretty close. I mean, weren't they up 3-1 against the Warriors, and then Chris Paul got injured, and then it kind of fell apart. But
but at the same time, when his projects fell apart and came close, he did so in pretty dramatic fashion. Like, he came close, but at the same time, failure was big. The times the Rockets failed. I mean, they lost to the Clippers, if I'm not wrong. With a 3-1 lead, they lost to, as you mentioned, to the Warriors.
Spurs.
So I mean, Spurs. So yeah, I mean, he failed in pretty dramatic fashion. Although I have to give him the fact that they were obviously close, and again, Houston was a very good team for the last 5 or 6 seasons. That's for sure. But the problems that we're talking about here, and especially you bring a very good point with the egos and the chemistry. They were very apparent with the Rockets. So
yeah, it's one of those things where there's a really big holistic process and approach that needs to go into this stuff. And I mean, let's be honest, one of the things that he also said was that I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was 5%. I could be wrong. He said that if you basically have a 5% chance of the title, you have to go for it. Get your chips all in. And that, I mean, that kind of came true. If you look at 2 of the champions the last 3 years, Toronto and Milwaukee, that's basically what happened. You put yourself in the position, you put all your chips on the table, you get a little bit lucky with the
that's a big point.
injuries on the opposite teams. Like Milwaukee's not.
Yeah.
I hate the asterisks on because I hate when people do that with the Raptors championship. So I don't want to do that with Milwaukee. But they're not going to beat. No one's beating Brooklyn if Brooklyn's healthy.
Exactly.
Phoenix is probably not getting out of the West if Kawhi doesn't have to.
Exactly.
Kawhi doesn't go down and whoever else went down. So a lot of things have to go your way also. But that's part of it. You just put yourself in that position, and
that's true. Yeah.
So I think that's probably what he meant also by if you have a 5% chance, you go for it. Obviously in football it's different because you can't tank in football. In basketball you have 2 paths: tank or
Right.
go for it, or go like very pragmatic, just years of rebuilding and stuff.
Or just be the Lakers or big markets team who can afford every free agent they want.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the analytics thing is fascinating, though. I'm very curious to see how it'll play out in the next few years or so.